Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video for those of you who are on-campus small group leaders at Dayspring. If you're teaching adults on Sunday mornings, this video is designed to help you get prepared for the September 7th small group study. So, thanks for viewing this video to help you get equipped to do that. Hopefully it'll be of help to you. What you should have with you now is a teaching transcript that's dated September 7th, 2014. If you've got that in front of you, you'll see that this is the beginning of our Scarlet Thread series, and I'm really excited about this. As we get ready to go through this coaching video, just take the transcript with you, grab something to write with. I'm going to be giving you hopefully some pointers along the way or some things to think through as you prepare to lead this lesson this Sunday. As we get ready to do that, let me remind you of what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is to build disciples. That's really what this is all about. And we're trying to do that a specific way. You know, for many, discipleship, their idea of discipleship is to learn as much as you can, as quick as you can. And the problem with that is when you pile on information after information after information, what happens is we get really wide in our discipleship, but we never get deep. And what we're trying to do as a church is grow people deep in discipleship, which means we try and latch on to not 100 different ideas in 1 week period, but one thing. You know, let God drill one thing into our lives all week long. So this lesson, as in all the other lessons that I'm going to be coaching you through, are designed to complement not just the Sunday morning large group environment sermon, but it's also designed to accompany the 7-day-a-week daily time alone with God readings, the memory verse. The idea is that we have a systematic and comprehensive and consistent time of teaching as a church body. So this lesson that you're looking at is going to complement the September 7 sermon as we start looking at the early pages of the Old Testament together. Now, this lesson you're going to teach, as you see, comes out of James chapter 1. And a couple of things about this lesson that I want you to be aware of. Two things, okay? Number one, this transcript that you have is long. It's longer than the transcripts that you normally have. So teaching this one is going to take you a little more time than usual. You need to be aware of that. It's going to leave less time for the group dialogue that you build into the end of your lessons. So just be aware of that there's a lot of content that you have in front of you. You're going to have to manage that as you teach it. There may be some points along the way that you decide aren't necessary to communicating the entire lesson. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But if you just teach it as it is, this is a long lesson, okay? So be aware of that. Be aware also, number two, that this lesson is kind of a part one of next week's lesson. So next week's small group lesson and the lesson you've got in front of you, it's really like one big long lesson that's been cut in half. So keep that in mind. It may be that as you look at this, you say, I'm not going to be able to cover all of this, but I want to. You may be able to bleed some of it over into next week's lesson. It may fit well that way. Just keep that in mind as well. But again, you're going to have to take this and kind of look through it and weed through it and manage it because of the length and because of the continuity with next week's lesson. You may have some molding and some shaping of this lesson to do, which you always need to do anyway, okay? But let's look at the lesson itself. Lesson overview on page 1. Just let me look at this with you, right there where it says what you're trying to teach. Here's what you're trying to teach. You're teaching a lesson on temptation, as you see. It says temptation is a fact of life. We know it, but we seem to see it as something that's more than just a fact of life. We see it as something that is formidable. We're going to give into it. But the Bible paints a different picture. As believers in Jesus, temptation can be overcome. The key is dealing with it before we face it. And using verses from James 1 as an anchor point, this teaching transcript provides a 3-point lesson that teaches how to overcome temptation. So that's what this lesson is about. And again, it's kind of a precursor to next week's lesson that'll talk about when we give in to temptation. So, having said all of that, let's look at the lesson itself and get your pen out and maybe make some notes along the way. Page 2 starts off with an introductory illustration, and it's one of my favorite stories from literature, from the Odyssey. And the Odyssey, in the story of the Odyssey, you have Odysseus, who is this character in the book, and there's this group called the Sirens, in the book who call out to these ocean farers, and they call out to them and they get them to drift off course and eventually, kill themselves. Well, Odysseus knows about the sirens and about the call of the sirens, and he knows that in his journey they're going to be calling out to them, and he knows that it's going to be such a strong tug that he prepares ahead of time and has himself, tied to the mast of the ship. He's tied to it so that he's not able to respond when the sirens come calling to him. So Odysseus basically prepared ahead of time for the temptation that he knew was going to come. That's what this lesson is all about. And that introduction there on page 2 and 3, it's setting up this whole notion that what we need to do is we need to know that temptation is a reality in life. It is something that's waiting around the corner. The key is not waiting till we get there and trying to figure out what to do. The key is making some plans ahead of time. So in this lesson, we're going to look at James 1, and we're going to learn some things about how to prepare ahead of time for temptation. So that's the introduction. I would highly recommend that you use it because it really does set up what you're trying to do here, all right? So having said that, let's look at the lesson itself, which starts on page 4. When you start reading from James chapter 1, let me get my Bible here. Here's the passage that you're going to teach through. James chapter 1, 13 through 18. I'm just going to read it to you so you can hear it. It says, "When tempted, no one should say, 'God is tempting me.' For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he's dragged away and enticed. Then after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, dear brothers. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created." That's your teaching text for this lesson, James chapter 1, 13 through 18. Now, here's a coaching tip for you, and it's actually printed on page 4 in that gray box. Here's a coaching tip for this lesson. You're going to draw upon a lot of Bible verses in this lesson, somewhere around 10 outside of James. So you're going to have a lot of, hey, listen to this verse, listen to this verse. What I would recommend that you do is go ahead and assign those out this week. Go ahead and email specific verses to about 10 different people and say, hey, would you be ready to read this verse when we do our small group lesson Sunday? That way you don't have so much time where you're just kind of pausing and waiting for people to flip around your Bible, and you don't have all that just silent time of people waiting for somebody to get to the Bible to read a verse, and therefore it kind of knocks the flow out and people forget what you were even talking about to start with. So if I were you, I would go ahead and assign all of these verses out, and what I would say is, hey, would you be ready to read this on Sunday? I may use this passage. Go ahead and have it flagged and ready. That way, not only are you killing all that dead time, but you're also giving some assignments to people, which will encourage them to actually, show up and be ready. So I would encourage you to do that. Now, that's your passage, James 1, 13 through 18. What you have now are 3 points that you're going to teach through. It's a 3-point lesson, basically. And these are the things that we need to do now to prepare for the temptations that we know are going to come, the sirens that are going to call out to us. What can I do now to be prepared for that? 3 things. Here's the first. Look at page 4. Number 1, we need to recognize the source of temptation. Recognize the source of it. Now, let me go ahead and tell you this. Number 1 of this lesson, this first point, there is a lot of overlap with the sermon on Sunday. Now, typically, what I'm teaching in the main room and what you're teaching in your small group room, they complement one another, but you're not necessarily saying the same information. Well, this is one of those times where we're going to be saying a lot of the same information. So, if you do feel that this lesson is pretty lengthy and that you would like to shorten it a little bit, this point may be one that you can shorten. You may decide that not all of these verses are necessary to have read or to expound upon them all, because there's going to be some repetitiveness of what you and I are going to say. But it may be that you want to teach it as it is. But that's just something to think through, okay? Here's the whole point of this first point about recognizing the source of temptation. James says, and I want you to hear his words again. He says, we don't blame God when we're tempted. We don't say God is tempting me, because God's not tempted by evil, nor does he tempt. But rather, everyone is tempted when, by our own evil desire, we are dragged away and enticed. Here's the point of this whole first point. We bear the responsibility of the temptation that we face. It's not enough to play the blame game and to say, the devil made me do it, or boy, this is just too much for me. We need to recognize the fact that the temptations that we are facing come from our own desires, our own evil desires. We are not just, involved in the process. We're to blame, but because we're the ones who are taking good things that God puts in our lives and twisting it and turning it into something that it ought not be. Now, here's some explanation I need to give you. Look at the paragraph that it says there can be some difficulty in understanding James' words here. I want you to understand what this is trying to communicate. In the New Testament, obviously, we're reading English translations of the Greek New Testament. In the Greek New Testament, the same word that is translated as test is the same word that's translated as temptation. So it's the same word. So there is a little bit of difficulty when you're reading the Greek New Testament. There's some difficulty in trying to understand, okay, so is this talking about a test or is this talking about a temptation, because it's the same word? How do I translate it? Well, flip over to page 5. Here's a good way of thinking about that. Look at the very top. It says, how do you think we're supposed to tell the difference between a test from God and a temptation of sin? And it says, I think the difference is found in the purpose behind what we're facing. Tests are meant to make us stronger in life. Temptations are meant to break and destroy us. So oftentimes a temptation is found in the very midst of a test. I like to think of it in a visual term like this sometimes. Think of it like a big block in your path, a big block. Well, is that block there to trip you up? Or is that block there to provide you with a step to something higher? Well, it can really be one and the same. God puts the blocks in our path that are intended to help us step on to something higher, something better. But what happens is, listen, here's what happens. Our own evil desires look at that block and see it as something different than what God intends for it to be. Does that make sense? So the whole point here is that, look at the bold print on page 5. This is the point of point number 1. The person who wants to honestly deal with sin must first look within. We must take responsibility, and we must acknowledge that there's something broken and wrong within us that takes even good things sometimes and twists them and contorts them into something that's just not good. And there are all kinds of examples of this. Again, because of the overlap with the sermon, you may decide to cut some of this out of your teaching transcript, and that'll be up to you. On page 6, you see that it goes even further in adding some more cross references and kind of building upon this idea even more that when tempted, it's coming from within. So I just really want your group to understand something. We can't blame the devil for everything. We can't just say, oh man, that temptation was so great, the devil's just been coming at me so hard. No, if we're going to overcome temptation, we have to fess up and say, hey, I bear the responsibility here. I took myself down a wrong path. I let my evil desires get the best of me. I let my own evil desires run me straight over that block that was in the road and trip me up. I can't blame God. I can't even blame the devil. I'm going to have to take responsibility for this. That's the point of point number 1. Here's number 2. Here's the second point. Not only do we understand the source of temptation, that it's coming from within, secondly, we must understand the severity of temptation. Now, listen to this. I want you to listen to this. Verses 13 and 14. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. Verse 14. But rather each one is tempted when, by his own evil desire, he is dragged away and enticed. dragged away and enticed. This second point is going to focus on those two expressions, dragged away and enticed. Now, you need to have some fun with this part in the sense that you can really get your group going right here. Those two terms, dragged away and enticed, your teaching transcript explains this. In James's world, those were expressions. One of those was a fishing expression. One of those was a hunting expression. Dragged away and enticed. The first word, dragged away, was a hunting expression. That which lures you out into the open. All right? The second phrase, enticed, was a fishing term. Something that covered up the hook, like a lure. Now, you've got two questions in this section that are designed to help your group have a little fun. Because listen, we're in Alabama, y'all. We've got a lot of hunters. We've got a lot of fishermen in our groups. A lot of people who hunt, a lot of people who fish. And I'm not just talking about the guys. You know it. The guys and the gals in your groups like to hunt and like to fish. So, at this point, what you're going to do in these two questions, you're going to say, hey, how many of you like to hunt and fish? Oh, I like to hunt and fish. At this point, you start saying, what's the best lure to use for fishing? Or what's the best, start talking in hunting terms. What's the best thing to get the deer out? What's the best way to feed? What's the best, scent? What's all of that? And let people start going back and forth. Well, I like this one. I like this one. And then, prompt all of this. Say, well, I think this guy's saying this one's better. Is this one better than yours? Let them kind of get after it a little bit, all in the sake of fun. Let them have some fun. And you've got all of this explained in here that what happens is our evil desires drag us out into the open field, or they bring us to the bait that's got the hook under it. Now, at this point, here's the kicker, and this is where the fun is over. Look on page 7. At this point, we get to verse 15. This is where we've got to understand the severity of temptation. Each one is tempted when our own evil desires were dragged away and enticed. Now look at verse 15. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Death. When our desires lead us out into the open field, or when our desires allow us to be enticed by the lure, it's no laughing matter, because it's taking us out into the open field to be shot and killed. It's dragging us to the bait so that we can be hooked and pulled out of the water and put on someone's frying pan. This is no laughing matter. Our own desires are luring us away to kill us. This isn't funny. Now, on page 7, that last whole section there, those last paragraphs with a couple of questions that you ask, that's very good content. Very good content. If I were you, I would make sure that I really focus on this. And if you're going to skip anything in this lesson, I wouldn't skip this part. Look at it. Look at it. I'm just going to kind of read this to you. It says, we have a tendency to downplay and even trivialize our temptations. We think of them as just some sort of inner battle that really isn't that big of a deal to lose, because after all, everybody deals with this and loses sometimes. Nobody's perfect, we tell ourselves. No big deal. But giving into temptation is a big deal, because its consequences are huge. Sin leads to death. Now look at the questions. What are some kinds of sins that we just tend to brush off and even make light of? Don't skip over that question, and don't ask it in a rhetorical sense. Let people bring it up. What are some sins that we've kind of learned to laugh at and say, think about it. Come up with your own list. Now, I can think of some. Gossip. Televisions and movies. Things that we shouldn't see. We learn just to say, it is what it is. Well, it is what it is. You know what it is? It's lure. It's bait that leads us out to be killed. And some of it, we just kind of shrug it off and laugh it off. There's nothing funny about it, really, because of the consequences. Look at the next question. If that sin, the ones that we just used for illustration, if that particular sin were to run its course, what would it kill in a person's life? Use these as examples. Talk about gossip, for example. If gossip is if we let it go without restraint, If we talk about somebody behind their back and spread the rumors and maybe even the truths, but if we spread all the information and all of that, if that runs its course, what will naturally happen as a result of that? Well, here's what will naturally happen. We'll kill our relationship with that person that we're talking about. And you know what else? Probably end up killing our relationship with the person we're talking to, because they're not going to trust us. They're going to know that we talk about people behind their back. Eventually, they're going to not share their secrets with us because, after all, we like to gossip. So when that one runs its course, you know what happens? It kills relationships. Whatever sin that people talk about here that we've learned to make light of, stop and say, okay, let's say that one runs its course, because that's what we're talking about here. Listen to the words of James. After it has, after our desire is conceived, we give in to sin. Sin, when it is full grown, when it runs its full course, it gives birth to death. So you're asking the question, if the sin that we kind of laugh off sometimes, if we let it run its full course, what's going to die in our lives? What's going to be killed in our lives? And when we really stop and think this through, there's really nothing funny about it. It's not a laughing matter. So, number one, to prepare for temptation, number one, we have to realize that temptation is going to come from within. We have to know to look there and to be ready for that. Number two, we have to know that giving in to temptation, this is severe stuff. It's really not laughing matter. We're talking about good things dying in our lives. Here's the third thing, page 7. We have to remember the alternative to temptation. The alternative to temptation. Verses 16 through 18 is where you're going to kind of dive in right here. And here's the point of this whole point. Here's the point of point number 3. God is good and God gives good things. I mean, it is pretty interesting in the flow of James' letter here that he's talking about temptation, and then all of a sudden in the same breath, he starts talking about how good God is and how God gives good things. We have to remember that there is an alternative to the temptations that we face, that there is an alternative, and the alternatives are always good. This is James' point. God is good. By the way, he's always good. He never changes. God is good. He always gives good things to us. He always wants to give good things to us. So, in battling temptation, we have to have our eyes open. We have to be looking for the good things in this life. We have to be pursuing the good things in this life that come from God. We have to be focusing and enjoying the good things that God gives us. In fact, a good cross-reference for you right here, it's not part of your lesson, but I encourage you, as the one preparing to lead this lesson, look up Philippians 4, verse 8. Just look at the instruction from the Bible there and think about it in terms of how it helps us overcome temptation. The point is this: God is good. He gives us good things. When we're focused on those good things and enjoying those good things, all of a sudden, the lure of the alternative, which is sin, it looks less appealing. It's like the old hymn says, that when we turn our eyes upon Jesus, the things of this earth grow strangely dim. So that's your point there. On page 8, you'll see that there are a lot of cross-references to help you make this whole point. This, again, may be a place where you say, hey, I actually don't need all of that to make this third point. If you do need all of that, there it is. All right, so pages 8 and 9 is how you get to the conclusion of that third point. So here's what you've taught so far. Temptation, we know it's going to come. We need to prepare ahead of time. So what do we need to do? Well, first of all, we need to know where this temptation is coming from. It's coming from within our own hearts. So we need to do the things there to help have clean hearts and pure hearts before God. Number 2, we have to really think about the severity of temptation. It's no laughing matter. It leads to death. Number 3, we have to look for, find, and enjoy the good things that God gives to His people. That's what we do that helps prepare us for the temptation that is sure to come. Having done all of that, look over on page 10. Now you're in the application moment. And again, you may not have as much time at this point in the lesson that you normally have, but here you are. Let me say this about the application moment, okay? Don't hit stop on the video here. please don't see the application moment as something that is just optional for your group time. Because the application moment is when you break your group into smaller clusters and you put the handout in their hand and they just start talking to each other now, okay? And talking things out. Don't see this as optional. In the book of Romans, Paul tells the church, he says, I know that you're capable to teach one another. Teaching one another is critical to spiritual growth. Your group members don't just need your voice. And they don't just need my voice. They need my voice. They need your voice, and they need each other's voice. The application moment is designed to get the group members in your group not just listening to other voices, but speaking. Do not do the disservice to your group members of letting them sit there and never talk, never talking it out. This is part of the lesson that we include every single time that's designed to build dialogue. So you've got your instructions there. You break them into clusters. You put the handout in their hands, which is page 12 in your lesson. Page 12 is the group handout that they're going to receive. And by the way, let me say this about the group handout. Don't forget that the group handout, when you distribute it, that when they get it, there's something on the back side on Sunday. And what's on the back side is the daily readings, hey, here's what we do, and a brief section to kind of help them get their wheels turning for the next lesson. Here's what I encourage you to do, because the back of that handout also includes the weekly memory verse. I really want you to push the weekly memory verse. From here on out, if you've been doing that, good, keep doing it. If you haven't done it, push it hard, because what I think you ought to do from this point forward, when you start your lesson, from this point forward, I think you ought to start your lesson by saying, hey, let's start off by talking about last week's memory verse. Let's say it together. I think you should build that into your lessons, because it's going to help you. In particular, this week's memory verse is going to really, really help you start off next week's lesson, because again, next week's lesson is kind of a part 2 of this lesson. But that's the handout. You got people in clusters. They're working all this stuff out together. Give them a few minutes to do that, and then conclude your lesson. You've got a conclusion on page 11. It's succinct, and you can just read it as is if you want to, because it finishes with, guess what? The weekly memory verse. So this is this week's lesson. It's about temptation. It's going to complement the sermon I'm going to preach out of Genesis 3 on Adam and Eve and the temptation they faced and the reality of sin, which, by the way, when we look at their story, we're actually going to be led to the one who overcame sin once for all, and who now indwells us, and who now provides for us a way to overcome the temptations that we are sure to face. All right? Thanks for listening in. I know this was a long video because it's a long lesson, but as you prepare this week, look over all those cross references. Really read them. Dwell on Philippians 4:8, and go ahead and start memorizing your memory verse as well. All right? Thanks for leading your small group. Thanks for listening in. I'll see you Sunday. Can't wait.